Well, thank you for showing the energy to be in attendance the last meeting of the last day of a 3-day meeting. With all the talk about stamina in the presidential campaign, maybe one of you should run for president. So the last time I was at a talk in Eureka, actually the last time I was in Eureka was in the early 90s. And it was sort of a different era then. That was the Redwood summer. Issues were much more contentious. And I was working, as Rick said, for the Department of Forestry and doing staff work for the board. And the board scheduled a meeting in Eureka. And we've spent a lot of time and effort preparing for that, both in terms of content and security and so on. And the meeting started, was a full crowd. There was a lot of tension in the room. And out of the back door came this group, Women Walking Tall. And basically they were a troupe that wore spotted owl and other critter costumes and walked on stilts. And they walked through the room, up the aisle in front of the dais, and they were disruptive, but there was sort of a calm that came over the session. And I remember my first thought was, I should have got a degree in theatric arts. So again, I've retired, come back to California with two ambitions: to be in the room with the next generation of people making decisions. And I like hearing how people are doing, and hopefully you all will make better decisions than the last group that was working, including myself. And in addition, I've really committed to a deep dive in terms of understanding the science that's coming forth in behavioral and brain science, because I think the key for me is trying to understand how to convert people to think in a much more positive way about commitments to nature and natural resources. And so that's what I'm doing. And again, I'm working with the university on this Distinguished Visitors Program, which allows us to bring experts in to deal with California resource problems, particularly private land problems. In the past, the format's been seminars on the Berkeley campus. What we're trying to do now is to focus on key decision-making statewide, and we've picked a place to start, the Sierra. And I'm working pretty closely with Sierra Conservancy and their watershed improvement plan. They have an MOU signed with the Forest Service and the Resources Agency and others, and it's a pretty incredible plan. It includes much of what I've heard talked about here: thinning, prescribed burning, pre-ignition planning, restoration. But to pull it off, they'd really work at a pretty unusual scale, maybe treating anywhere up to 500,000 acres a year. Now, I don't think 500,000 acres have been treated over the last decade, so you can imagine what it would be like to scale up. And I've spent since January just talking to people trying to figure out how to do it, or how to work with them. I mean, we're just be a very small part of it, but want to really support that work. So it was in that context that Rick asked me if I'd be interested in talking today, and I'm pretty busy. I'm not working full time. I haven't really thought much about redwoods in the last 20 years, so I thought I'm probably not the best person to do it. But I took it on, and so, but I said I'll take it on, but what I'll do is just kind of go over a draft prospectus, if you will, for if this main program worked in the North Coast, what we'd think about doing, as well as try to summarize some of the things I've heard over the past several days. So, I mean, that's the format I'm going to use. And I think the place you'd start building a prospectus is really how this symposium's been organized. So the environmental science, the policy, the market and economic stuff. But also I think it's really important that we become much more adept at understanding the psychological literature and messaging. And, I think having a session or two on that here would have been better, and it's what I'm really trying to work on, probably overdoing it, but it just happens to be my interest now. And I think it's just incredibly important that we bring Redwood issues to a larger audience. I think all of you know that, in boardrooms, in the legislature and so on, we need to be represented. They need to help us. And without better communication with them, I just don't think we're going to get there. For all intents and purposes, the environment is still treated as a free good. I mean, we're making some progress, but we use it without paying for it, and we use it as an offset for everything else. And that just has to change over time. And I don't think it's going to change by building, any number of markets. I think it has to change in people's heads. So I'm looking forward to that. When you get older and retire, you can be pretty Pollyannish, so it's great. Just a couple sort of background truth in lending pieces. I am personally really moved by what's going on in the Sierra, the tree mortality and so on, and so that influences, how I'm talking today and how I'm working. Secondly, I am trying to swear off using PowerPoint. And I'm sort of in the earlier stage of adopting a conversational style, and you'll see I'm not that good at it yet, and I'm going to be reading some from my notes. But I have one slide, which is actually a pretty incredible slide. I went on the internet and found it in about 5 minutes. I have no idea who took it or when it was taken, and you can't really read the little note on the side there, but it says, "Elsewhere in the world, there are no redwood trees like these," which to me sort of says exactly what I want to talk about. Maybe with another note that says, "Handle with care," and then another one that says, "Make more resilient." To me, that's really what this conference was about, and what I'm trying to think about. And just sort of what early learnings I'm having from looking at some of this neuropsychological literature and so on is to change minds. And I think we need to change a lot of minds, including our own, in terms of how we perceived our commitments to nature. You've got to go deep. I mean, that's just what it says. And you've got to ask some fundamental questions. And so the premise, which I hope is true, is that the adoption of environmental ethics will win when other value propositions fail or to deliver or are abusive. And I really hope that hypothesis ends up being so. So what I've done then in starting this prospectus is to pose two questions. What is our responsibility to ensure that redwoods survive? And what strategies are required to accomplish such an objective? These are pretty high-level questions, but again, I think what I'm learning is you need to start like this if you want to change somebody's mind who's never even thought about this stuff. The answers to both questions are difficult to arrive at and hard to validate, but really if we're not willing to address these fundamental issues, we'll not be successful. We will not be successful at managing and protecting redwoods over time. Of course, I think the answer to the first question is that we do have a responsibility to ensure survival. I mean, redwoods are a unique and significant presence that demand we work hard on their behalf. And this is a conclusion based in part on what they can tell us about our own ability to survive. I mean, what would it say about us if we knowingly lose or severely impair this resource? And on the field trip yesterday that I went down to Humboldt Redwoods, and Mike Miles was talking about change in management based on the Murrelet and Coho, was just amazing to me. And then talked about taking the principles of that HCP and moving it through the State Forest Practice Act. I mean, I think it's possible, and obviously the Fisher family has had something to do with this, but that you can take an ethical stance and change behavior. Responding to the second question, the strategies for redwood sustainability, and I'm going to be way behind here, so I'm going to need to figure out what to do. So that there are 4 things we need to do to openly evaluate the success of current programs. 2, to implement a more effective way of anticipating and countering outside threats. 3, given that climate change is a reality, we should work to reestablish redwoods in a portion of their prior range. And then the priority, in my view, is to develop a much more powerful overarching narrative to frame our responsibilities and to gain greater buy-in. There's really been 3 primary disruptions in, as Bill Libby said, the Holocene population. The extensive market-driven logging in the earlier part of the last century, the more recent conversion of private forest land from primarily a timber to primarily a financial asset, and the effects of temperature and precipitation variability due to climate change. I think most of us know about the market-driven logging in the last century, the response to it. Jerry Rhodey gave really good color to that effect. Out of that came the Forest Practice Act. You know, at that same time, fortunately, the environmental community, scientists, philanthropists, formed, say, the Redwood League, established the state parks, and the Redwood National Park. And that gave us really a way to have these discussions moving forward. Tom Techman talked quite a bit about the change in the ownership of private land, driven largely by this change in federal law that allowed institutional owners to invest in hard assets. The forest industry nationwide has completely changed. Weyerhaeuser went from a company with 5 businesses and 80,000 people to a real estate investment trust merged with Plum Creek with 12,000 people. This all happened as an unanticipated consequence of actions in Washington, D.C. and Wall Street that we should have been involved with, because nobody was talking about what this change meant. So if we think about climate change, and I heard some really good talks here the last couple of days about the effect, but it's really in the Sierra where I think we get a first taste of what all this means. 67 million dead trees. And one of the learnings of the Sierra crisis is that the stands hardest hit are the older stands, more densely stocked and devoid of management. The national forests, which have been operated under a variety of different strategies over the past 40 years, have the highest incidence of mortality and severe fire. According to Bill Stewart at UC Berkeley and others, active management on private, family, and industrial land is resulting in stands with the healthiest components. Tactics to address climate influences have the potential to turn orthodoxies on their head. I think it's starting to be evident that interventions in management, in addition to reserves and special habitat areas, are required to sustain biological diversity, sequester and retain carbon, and ensure water flows. This is not news, I think, to most of you, and we saw this on the field trip yesterday, but it's going to be news to a lot of people who are embedded in different approaches to protecting the environment. Let me just go to this last point, since it's the area I'm working most in, and it's really how do we develop a compelling narrative frame. There are good opportunities, I think, to use storytelling and narrative to give nature the same status we give ourselves. This is really what Aldo Leopold had in mind when he coined the phrase thinking like a mountain. His premise was that by conceptualizing the mountain as a long-lived ecological system involving natural and human components, people can expand their thinking and be better able to manage in a sustainable way. I mean, the interesting thing is this is what the findings in behavioral and brain science are beginning to demonstrate, that perceptual, cognitive, and affective systems combine to frame human decision-making, and it's stories and narratives that are the most effective means to unify these basic components. To quote Jonathan Haidt, who has just written a great book, if you haven't read it, called The Righteous Mind, says that the human mind is a story processor, not a logic processor. Everyone loves a good story. Every culture bathes its children in stories. The communication effort by Save the Redwood League and others, I think, follow many of these principles. And I think we can suggest several themes that ought to be part of our communication. First, really be clear about the goals of conservation action. Understanding that protecting nature is really always about serving a human purpose. I mean, this is what Richard Dawkins talked about in The Selfish Gene. I mean, we're here largely because of that orientation. Second, I think we need to employ a long-lived frame. It's good to go back and talk about the history of redwoods and 100 million years and so on. Third, I think expressing the sanctity of nature. Sanctity is often taken to mean inviolate, to not be touched or desecrated. But applied to redwoods, this could mean that redwoods should only be set aside and left alone. But if you really look at the initial meaning of sanctity, it had more to do with contamination and was a guide to action. So as we enter the Anthropocene, human intervention to stem human influences can take on a compelling moral focus. This is becoming obvious, I think, almost everywhere in California, and really, I think, is something we should use to challenge some deeply held beliefs that others have. And fourth, I think we need to really avoid moral tribalism and try to expand group identity. I mean, I see much more collaboration now than I used to see, but I still hear a lot of the blame game going on. And we really need to stop pitting ourselves against each other because, you know, we really basically want the same thing. So to just conclude this perspective then, what I would, recommend as a first shot at how this program at Berkeley might come in and work with the North Coast community to deal with any bottlenecks and how you're moving forward, is that we'd start framing messages in terms of survival for both the trees and for us, to really emphasize the importance of management and intervention as well as for reserves, to support the existing effort to move, maybe to reestablish redwoods, to anticipate the outside threats. And, just in the end, I think this is it. Elsewhere in the world, there are no redwood trees like these. I mean, it's up to us to treat them well and to build resilience and to think about spreading them further afield so they're more robust given the changes that are coming.
We do have times to take some questions or respond to some of Bob's comments there, so I'll leave Bob here and Jan and I will run around with the mics.
I hope I understood that you were offering that UC is going to interact with communities, and I'd like to offer Sonoma County as one. How do we do that?
Talk to Rick or Bill Stewart. No, absolutely. That's wonderful. We'd like to do that. Thank you for the offer. Okay.
That was really great, Bob. I think we all listened very carefully. Your very last point, though, which the prior question addressed, you said, how can Maine come up here and help us? And the reason I question this...
And you want to come to Berkeley and help me?
No. This is not where the problem is. If you think about it, the legislature now has no members who were around in 2006 when the climate bill was passed. We have to educate an entirely new crop of legislators. 2/3 of those legislators plus are from urban areas, and the entire theme now is environmental justice. There are new terminology coming about legislators of color. They're coming from urban areas that do not have their business oriented. They have not grown up with an environmental ethic. And the communication, in my mind, needs to go there because we don't have enough rural legislators to carry the policies that affect us. And
and your question?
If you look, how can you look at these environmental justice communities and help educate them into the importance of all these values that we know and care about?
Yeah, and obviously there's a lot to learn from them, too. So.
One little note, Assemblymember Wood and his staff spent the whole day with us yesterday on one of the field trips. I know. Anyone else?
Good. All right. Thanks, Bob.